have Alan Andersen, who was previous CSRO, now Charles Darwin University. Is that correct? Yep. And he's going to, if you know a little bit about ants of the Northern Territory, and if you care for them, probably it's Alan's fault. He is the person who has been telling people to care about ants and how ants are awesome, and a few other things for quite a while now. And I think he has been quite successful. A lot of people do appreciate and understand the importance of the group that he studies. And I think that he, since the beginning, had that vision of not just to keep his science to himself and his colleagues, but also to provide information to the general public. So he had a vast experience on this area that I invite him to share with us today. And here he is. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Carla. Thank you, everyone, for coming here in person, and hi to you. I hope you're not doing too much multi-skilling back at home, watching Netflix or whatever, but good to have you on board. Yeah, so Carla said that I've got a fair bit of experience communicating my love of ants, and that's very true. But I've got a bit broader experience communicating science. So I've had a lot of experience leading large research teams that look more broadly at the ecology and management of our landscapes. And through all that, we've had a very strong commitment to science communication. And we've always had deeply embedded in our research team a professional science communicator. And I've got to say, the pressure is really on me at the moment, because we have a professional science communicator in the audience who's going to be talking in a couple of weeks' time. So Carla asked me to just share some of my experiences as someone who's had a bit of experience with science communication, particularly up here. So the first thing I want to say is this. It's very simple, isn't it? But scientific communication really is the same as any other communication in terms, it's all about telling a story. Telling a story that's interesting and that people can relate to. They go hand in hand, because if people can relate to your story, then they'll find it increasingly interesting. What do people want to know about stories? Well, I think there are three really important things, and here they are. So what's a story about? How does it end? And so what? What does it mean? So it's all about relevance, outcomes, and importance. Whether it's a fictional story or whether it's a science story you want to tell, that I think is critical. And we'll come back to that. Relevance, outcomes, and importance. Because if you look at what people want to know, it has a sort of like an hourglass shape. They want to know, to start off with, how's all this relevant? Why would I be interested in hearing your story? And then they might want to know a little bit about the details of how you construed the story. But they want to know much more about, well, what actually happened? What's the outcome? And what does it all mean? Mean back to the relevance that you started talking about at the start. What does it all mean? In other words, what is the impact? It's all about impact. That's what people want to hear. Now, practicing scientists have a very different shape to what they actually do, nodding at the head, and spend their time. Because the vast majority of a scientist's time is this stuff, methods and data, and that's sort of like always day to day thinking about your methods and data and the loop between them. And so often when you ask a scientist, oh, you're doing a whatever project, tell us about what you do, it's sort of straight into them doing this fancy methods and here's all my data, and you're thinking, well, who cares, why? And you know, because it's really the relevance and the outcome is importance that you're interested in. And so that's why often there's a disconnect between scientists in their communication to the public, and even scientists in their communication to other scientists, because at the end of the day, other scientists who are not in your particular field, they also want to know about the relevance, the outcomes, and the importance not the details of all your fancy methods and your vast reams of data that you've managed to collect along the way. And so I want to go through, illustrate some of this with two case studies that I was involved with. Both involve working with Aboriginal communities, both involve with working with fire, but very different projects. And this is the first one, Aboriginal wetland burning in Kakadu. So it automatically ticks a lot of public interest boxes. Aboriginal people working on the land, Kakadu National Park. So, you know, we've already started off with some intrinsic interest, but it's a really interesting story. And it goes something like this. We all know about Kakadu's wetlands. And so any brochure extolling the values of Kakadu, often it's the wetlands that will feature because that's where most of the wildlife is concentrated. And the reason it's concentrated there is that the wetlands occur on clayey soils, which are very highly fertile, unlike the soils in the surrounding landscape that have got very low nutrients and therefore cannot support much plant productivity and therefore the animals living on them. But when you combine highly fertile soils with water, you get explosion of wildlife, which is why the vast majority of native biomass, you know, whether it's magpie geese or crocodiles, you'll find it on the wetlands. And in fact, just a little side story, you might have heard about the work that has been done on water pythons and their prey, the rat, at Fog Dam. You heard about that one? So the highest biomass of any predator population and any prey population, that's there. Anyway, so it's also the centre of biomass of introduced feral animals too, pigs and buffalo and whatever, for that same reason. Anyway, so we know all this and gorgeous landscapes, but an entirely different perspective is from the local Aboriginal people who live there and have lived there for tens of thousands of years. It provides extremely important food and other cultural resources. It's not just a biodiversity in the Western conservation sense. It's a living biodiversity, natural and cultural resource landscape for them. And a lot of the local people still hunt and gather on those floodplains, and it's a really important part of their, not just their diets, but their lifestyle. And there's been a fundamental problem. This hasn't reached the public much and hasn't reached scientists much either, but this problem. So back before the 1990s, you're probably aware that the floodplains of Kakadu and elsewhere in the top end supported vast numbers of water buffalo, introduced water buffalo. And there was a major eradication program back in the late 80s and 90s, which essentially eliminated buffalo from Kakadu and other parts of the top end. And when that happened, taking out a disturbance agent from the floodplains, this native grass, this native hymenac, just exploded in abundance and took over vast areas of the floodplains that look much like this, which not only reduces the biodiversity values from a Western science and tourism perspective, but also reduces the availability of really important bush foods and cultural resources for the resident Aboriginal population. And so this problem developed over 10 or 20 years, and then it reached such a stage that it was a really serious management issue. And one of the traditional owners from a family that we ended up working with, Violet Lawson, remembered that her grandfather used to talk about traditional burning of wetlands. And we're talking about wetlands and fire don't normally sort of go together. And it soon became apparent that the effects of buffalo feeding and trampling on the wetlands and therefore removing a lot of the biomass of this native grass had a similar impact to traditional Aboriginal burning, which did a similar sort of thing. And that she thought, what I'll do is I'll reintroduce burning and re-establish these highly biodiverse and culturally important landscapes through that way. And so she got her daughter, Sandra, her partner, Peter Christopherson, onto this and the rest of their family. And it's not just, oh, well, let's just burn it, because we're talking about often there's a metre of water in the floodplains. So it's not just a matter of flicking a match out and burning it and walking away, because there's two issues. The first one is, because it's often underwater, you have to burn under extreme fire weather conditions to get it going. And in order to do that, you've had to have protected the surrounding savanna landscapes. Otherwise, the fire would just get out and you know, just burn uncontrolled outside. And the native grass, hymenac, is not a fire-sensitive grass. You can't just burn it and it will die and other things will replace it. It will just grow back. And so they have to burn it many, many times. And so initially they'll burn it and it doesn't burn the whole, the grass stalks and leaves. But what it does do, there's some dry components at the bottom and the fresh material just sort of falls over and dies. And then you leave it to cure for a few more days and come back and burn it and then burn it again. Because the idea is you want to end up killing the rhizomes that are in the soil and burn them out so that you eliminate this grass. So it's a complicated burning procedure. And it has the most dramatic impact on biodiversity you could ever imagine. So one season of fire treatment converts this to that, just by eliminating the native hymenac, and it encourages all this other plants to grow, and because it's much more open environment, and then all the wildlife just come in. And we did some scientific studies to show what was happening here. And so here's a satellite, a remote sensing assessment of the burning impacts. And here on the left-hand side is before the burning was started. And all this, what colour would you call it? Orangey browny colour is hymenac. Basically just one big monoculture of hymenac. And then the burning occurred south of this line. And so north of it's still just totally dominated in hymenac. But you can see after removing hymenac, all these other vegetation types, these different colours represent different vegetation types. So we come up with a highly heterogeneous landscape converted from a highly homogeneous monoculture of hymenac. We also did some bird surveys just to document all this. And so here's the Coimbra home billabong. Many of you will know that. And we surveyed birds, well, they surveyed birds at a number of these sites. Some that are long unburnt in green, burnt just last year in red, and then burnt a few years ago. And here's the data showing the number of waterfowl species and the abundance of them in these sites that are treated in different ways. So in the long unburnt, there's virtually nothing there. In contrast, just burnt last year, you know, vast numbers of both species and individuals. Burnt 3 years ago, somewhere in between, because if you just burn on one occasion, the hymenac will come back again. You see, come back, come back, come back, come back, and therefore reduce habitat heterogeneity and reduce the favourability of the landscape for waterfowl. And so it's an ongoing process of burning each year to maintain these very high densities and diversities of birds. And so in terms of the outcomes from the work, it's really, I think, a really nice story because it does a number of things. So it enhances biodiversity from a Western science and conservation perspective. These are the landscapes that Kakadu National Park is renowned for. It enhances the cultural values for the resident Aboriginal people. It forms an opportunity for the passing down from one generation to the next of traditional ecological knowledge relating to floodplains, not just to do with burning, but just floodplain ecology and management and use, cultural use, more generally. It's a great example of this two toolbox approaches. You've probably heard that term before, is combining Western science with traditional ecological knowledge. And then putting it all together, we've presented it as a really important model for the joint management of national parks, where they have an Aboriginal owned land managed for national parks. So I think we've got a really good story. And we've communicated in a number of ways. And so the first way is a standard scientific paper where we, you can go into all the detail and lots of data and, that sort of stuff, which is fine. Fine for the 5 or 10 people, scientists, to read that. And then we do the normal thing of, yes, we put out some glossy brochures for the public. So we've done that. So this brochure was paid for and handed out by Coimbra Management. So everyone who goes to Coimbra got one of these brochures. Because it's so true that the proportion of people who prefer reading detailed information as opposed to pictures is very small. There are some people who love detail, but most people, it's pictures, like it, and sort of reduced text, which is why these things are so effective. But the extension of that, lots of pictures and reduced text, is moving pictures and no text videos. And so I'm going to be talking about the power of video, because these are, videos are often, for many people, particularly English as a second language or third or fourth language, people who don't have particularly high levels of education, but just generally people who prefer watching and hearing things than reading things, and that's a lot of people. So, videos, what do we do? The first thing about a video is you've got to be on message. Now, Jane will tell you this, on message. Righto, none of these rambling rants of people, on message. What do I mean? Relevance. So what's the relevance of all this? Well, it's all about Indigenous natural resource management, which everyone likes hearing about. Good. What's the end of this? So what's the outcome? The outcome, here it is. It's enhanced natural and cultural resources as well as biodiversity in a Western sense. That's the outcome. So why is it important? Well, model for joint management of these co-managed national parks. So that's the message we wanted to get across. But here's an important thing. How do you tell that message? This is so important. It has a much greater impact if you get the people who are affected, tell the story, because then it becomes their story. And it's not just, here's another scientist talking about their project, it becomes their story, which then reinforces the messages that you want to give, which is, Indigenous natural resource management, enhanced model for joint management, rather than, oh, here's another project and here's a scientific paper and some neat data. And so I'll be showing you a video. The people involved will be telling the story. It's most of the traditional owners telling their story, but also the park manager saying how important that is for park management. So if we get that going.
My mother taught me a lot about looking after country. You look after the country and country will look after you. Yeah, my daughter Sandra and Peter and my grandchildren, they out there helping out burning and looking after country.
When you go out there in the grass, then just keep an eye out for pigs when you're walking out. They lie under the thick hymenacing out there. Okay, before we start, you got your matches? Alright, Paul, you know how to light it then. I'll just remind you in case you've forgotten. You always strike downwards and always drop your match on the downside of the fire. Okay, so you don't get trapped in flames.
when we burn the floodplains, one of the important things is that we require a lot of wind to actually move the fire out across the water, and remembering the water can be over 1 metre deep. And so we need the big winds to actually push the fire out over those wetlands. And burning before a storm comes is the prime time. So you have this huge driving wind that's coming from the storm, and then suddenly the rain falls and just puts it all out. It's all over very quickly.
It's important to have the whole family involved so that knowledge and skill is learnt out here while we're doing the practical stuff. So it's easier for them to watch how creatures move and how fire behaves with wind, and how we can show them how fire can actually burn over water.
Early in the dry season, we have to put in the early burns around the wetland fringes, and that protects the woodland from later fires, which we would be putting in say September, October. It's important that we burn the woodlands associated with the edges and also the springs that feed into those wetlands, so that fires will not travel out later on in the year.
Cultural resource management is the key objective of the park. As park manager, I see the Boggy Plains project being the coming together of shared interests. From Park's point of view, we're seeking biodiversity outcomes. Aboriginal people living here are seeking a sustainable ecosystem to meet their stewardship or their cultural obligations and for healthy food.
This is the first burn here. You can see where the fire is actually going through and burning the dead grass underneath, and then the new growth is actually burning off and falling, and as that falls to the ground, and then that'll cure or dry in the next 3 days, and then you can come in and burn that the green grass that's fallen down. That'll cure for 3 days, and then you can do your second lot of burns then.
Early results are showing that with the removal of hymenac off the wetlands, I think in 2002 we reduced the hymenac by 40%, and we had huge increases in other vegetation such as wild rice, nulumbo, nymphaea, all the lilies, and we had a large recruitment of paperbarks and other herb species. You can see here, once we've started to thin out the native hymenac, you can see all these other plants starting to come through. Some of the different herbs have come back, and also this grass here, you can see it's a much finer, thinner grass, and that's native rice. And it's a very important food source for the young fledgling magpie geese. Once they're old enough to move off the nest, then the adults don't want to take them too far to find food. And so selecting a nesting site is very important to enable them to collect feed very quickly. The major significance in this project is that that Aboriginal people really have to take responsibility and manage their different landscapes appropriately, particularly here in the wetlands, where wetlands are continually changing. People have to be up with that change and move and manage those wetlands appropriately, not only for the biodiversity side of it for national parks, but also for their cultural needs, their sustainable lifestyles, to be able to hunt their major food sources from here. And to be able to do that, we have to manage them appropriately.
The Boggy Plains project provides a learning opportunity. For whitefellas such as me, it provides me an opportunity to see how Aboriginal people use fire. It also allows Aboriginal people to use science to communicate to the world that what they're doing makes a difference.
this is really a good example of how joint management can work. We have a national park, we have park managers, we have Aboriginal people on Aboriginal land. Two different types of outlooks on life, two different sciences, two different ways of doing things. And I suppose this is an example of combining all of those differences into one package and not only managing a landscape to suit cultural needs, but looking at its major outcomes and relating them back to park values. And I think this is the way that Aboriginal people will be moving towards into the future.
So on message, relevance. On message we have, I think, relevance, outcomes, impact. So I've got another case study that I just want to show you, talk you through. And this is the Tiwi Carbon Study. So it's about fire management, but it's about savanna fire management. And it's about the really important developments over recent decade or two with the engagement of local landowners and particularly Indigenous landowners in the national carbon economy. In that, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the savanna burning development, but the fires from the burning of our savannas make an important contribution to Australia's national greenhouse gas accounts. Australia is the only country in the world that has this such burning, this biomass burning, as a formal part of their greenhouse gas accounts. And the burning of our savannas on average contributes about 4%. So these are the emissions from smoke that have methane and nitrous oxide in them, contribute about 4% of Australia's total greenhouse gas emissions. So it's 4%, it's only 4%, but it's 4% of a very, very large figure. And so the amount of emissions from these fires depends on two things: the extent of them, in other words, how much area is burnt, but also the seasonality, in that the more intense fires burn more biomass per unit area. And so that fires later in the dry season will cause more emissions than fires early in the dry season, even if the same area is burnt, if you get what I mean. And so there's now the capacity for local landowners to register a project on their land in which, if they've demonstrated that they have changed fire management and reduced the extent of greenhouse gas emissions, they will get carbon credits. And this is happening over a very large proportion of Northern Australia now, earning the landowners, including remote Aboriginal communities, millions of dollars, which can then be reinvested into other ranger groups and other land management activities. So it's a really fabulous story. And so when I was with CSIRO, we helped the Tiwi community set up one of those registered projects. There's a lot of background work one has to do to set up, and we helped them with that. But the Tiwi people, Tiwi Islands, as you probably know, is a nationally significant area for wildlife. Many endangered species are there. And Tiwi people are very, very proud of that. But they're also highly value the plants and animals. And so they would not want to change burning in a way that would have a negative impact on their plants and animals, even if it is making them lots of money. So a key part of our work with the Tiwi people was not just setting up a registered savanna burning project, but also setting up long-term experimental fire plots where we burnt these plots in different ways to look at how biodiversity is affected, to ensure that any new ways of burning to earn carbon credits was not going to have a negative impact on biodiversity. And so this is what this story is all about. And again, you know, go through the process of standard academic paper, all the details, methods and data and sort of thing are there, and a range of communication products for the general public and for Tiwi people in particular. But we also put together a video, and we've got the same 2 points on message. What were the messages here? How is it relevant? Well, it's all about global warming and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Well, that's pretty damn relevant. What are the outcomes? Well, we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions while protecting biodiversity. So that's a nice story. You know, who cares about that? Well, it's all about Indigenous livelihoods, the development of Indigenous livelihoods through engagement with the national carbon economy. It's all about. The second point we talked about, you know, it's much better to get those affected to tell the story, so it's their story. So the story is told fundamentally by Tiwi land managers. The one I'd add on though is this third dot point, and that is scientists can be used to give authority when there's sort of technical issues. And so we've done that in this video. It adds sort of scientific credibility. But the point of it is the scientists need to be on message and give a grab. Jane will tell you all about these grabs. Say your point in a few words to make your point very clearly, not a sort of long, incoherent rant taking up unnecessary time and space and attention. Short and sweet. So that's how this video is different from a communication perspective. It includes some scientists having a bit of a say about the technical sorts of issues.
The Tiwi Islands, 80 kilometres north of Darwin, are home to 2,000 Tiwi people, including me, Willie Real. The largest island, Melville, is the second largest island off the Australian mainland.
Bigger than on the mainland.
It's here the CSIRO is working with the Tiwi people on the Tiwi Carbon Study. Tiwi Carbon Study will help improve our future. Throughout our history, one thing has never changed, our connection to the land. But we know the way we use the land has to change if we are to have a strong future for us and our kids.
Edinburgh, what do you think of this big fella?
Our land has always supported the lives of our people. It has provided food, shelter, medicine, weapons, tools, and ceremony purposes.
What's the Tiwi name for
We
it?
call this sometimes Tarakali.
Tarakali.
Tarakali, yeah, this is.
That's a nice name.
We all depend on the land, the water, the plants, the animals, everything. But things are changing.
Fighting stick. They make fighting stick out of that too, yeah.
Okay, hardwood.
Yeah, fighting stick with this tool and spear.
Opportunities for our work are very limited here, so we need to use the land in new ways to create jobs that will benefit our kids and grandkids. One way is to become part of a new carbon economy.
The ultimate goal of the Tiwi Carbon Study is to help Tiwi people engage with the emerging carbon economy, and Tiwi people have a great opportunity to do that by reducing the amount of carbon pollution that occurs when the Tiwi landscapes are burnt each year.
The Tiwi bush burns a lot during the dry season. These fires give off methane and nitrous oxide. These are greenhouse gases. We want to cut back those greenhouse gases and get more carbon stored in the soil and plants.
So the way this will work in the emerging carbon economy is that the industries that are causing carbon pollution can compensate for that by funding what we call these offset projects. And those funds can go to, in this case, Tiwi people to help them manage the fire to create those offsets.
Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to get some tools out and start to measure all the things along this transect. We're going to do.
We are working with CSIRO to find ways to reduce those greenhouse gases and store more carbon. We want to earn those carbon credits, but first we need to learn how to measure the changes we are making.
You see both things together.
In order for these offset projects to work, we need to be able to account for the carbon in a really rigorous way. And in order to do that, we need to understand the science behind how fire affects the amount of carbon stored in ecosystems.
The Tiwi Carbon Study has controlled fires on 18 experimental plots.
You gotta look back every second behind you when you're walking.
We use drip torches to light fires in the early dry season. These fires are not so big. They break up the country so we don't get those big hot fires later in the year.
Whenever we burn one of these plots, we go in immediately beforehand and measure how much grass and litter is there, and then immediately after the fires, we see how much is left so we can calculate how much carbon is burnt.
For the soil, we use augers and bulk density rings. CSIRO can then measure the carbon in the soil samples.
We take it back to Darwin, we put it in an oven so it gets nice and dry. Then we sieve it, we grind it up, and we send it down to Adelaide. And down in Adelaide, they have a machine where they can measure soil carbon.
Shrubs are measured and recorded. Leaves store carbon, and when they burn, they release greenhouse gas. We need to know how to burn to help plants store more carbon.
So we've been measuring many pools of carbon in the trees, in the grasses, in the soil. And we've, on average, found that the plots across the Tiwi Island can store up to 100 tonnes of carbon per hectare. And carbon stored in the soil is really important. It's as important as the carbon stored in our trees and our grasses. And we want to manage fire so that we store the most amount of carbon in our soil on the Tiwi Islands.
Looking after the Tiwi plants and animals is an important part of the study. The red goshawk is one of Australia's rarest birds of prey, and here's a nest right in the middle of our burn-off.
There's not a lot of nests like that around. The nearest one is probably about 8 kilometres. So we're going to just water the water around the tree to make sure when the fire comes through, it doesn't affect the tree and it doesn't affect around where the nest is above in the tree.
We're also looking at other animals in the fire plots.
Now, Tiwi has some of the most diverse ant communities on Earth here. So anywhere around here in the bush, we can get up to 100 or more different species just in a hectare. And there's many of them that are found nowhere else on Earth.
These ants can tell us a lot. If the ants are in good shape, it's likely the bush is in good shape.
This one's a horned pony ant because, I don't know if you can see there, but you can see the horns on the side of the head there, like a, yeah. And so its species name is Taurus after bull. So that's quite a good one.
After we burn, we go back to the plot and do more measurements.
So if you just head straight down that way, you just keep walking. Yep, so 100 metres.
We collect litter, vacuum up the ash, and put it all into bags. It's important that we provide opportunities for our kids so they can have choices for the future. We include Tiwi College students in our work so they can learn more about science and more about their country. And maybe some of them will end up being a ranger like me.
So what we'll do is we'll wrap the tape around the tree. It's actually a rapid assessment technique that we use. So we're working over large areas, and so what we get is a very good snapshot of what we have in these regions, fuel load wise. From that, we can work out exactly how much carbon we have in these systems. 49.5. Look through here, keep both eyes open.
And then we've got much longer term research activities where we've marked a lot of these trees. We're looking at how fast trees grow, how big the trees get, and how fire affects that.
Waypoints.
We use a GPS to locate the trees on the study site.
Okay, so here we have all the satellites represented, and what it's saying is it's over here in the south, in that direction over there.
It is still too early to know how the fires affect carbon stock, but there may be a lot more carbon in plant and soil than we realise.
So this is the start point. What we're going to do now, we can switch that off. We'll start here and we'll run a tape measure out in this direction.
This could be really important for the amount of carbon credits we get.
Some preliminary work that CSIRO has done has shown that there's potentially, in the emerging carbon economy, millions and millions of dollars worth of carbon pollution that's going up in the air. And if we can just reduce the amount of fires that are occurring in here, that means it's an economic opportunity for people living in these remote areas, and particularly remote Indigenous communities who have very limited other economic opportunities.
To keep our country healthy, to keep our people healthy, we need new information. Things are changing on the Tiwi Islands, so we've got to think about doing things in new ways.
So our work at CSIRO has shown that if we reduce fire frequency from the current frequency of one fire every 2 to 3 years to a fire every 4 to 6 years, we can store 4 times more carbon in the soil compared to that which would have been released in the smoke.
We must bring together our knowledge of the past with the new science. What do the fires do? What's happening with the animals and plants? What's happening underground in the soil?
The Tiwi people have always understood and cared for country. But now we need to use new knowledge because the world around us is changing. This story about country is both an old story and a new story. Most of all, it is an important story affecting all our lives here on the Tiwi Islands.
Thank you. So that's it from me. So happy to take any questions, or if anyone wants to raise any issues, including from folk at home. Is that right? Folk at home can ask questions here. Yeah.
So anybody has questions here first on the audience?
So I understand the pamphlets are for the general public and the videos as well. Was there communication done to decision makers within that using the same techniques or something different?
Yeah, so the decision makers. So in that first one, the Kakadu example, that was the decision maker telling the story. So the head of the park was there. The Tiwi example, Willie Rioli was narrating. So he's the head ranger. The decision makers are Tiwi Land Council, and so we had a close relationship with the Tiwi Land Council and gave many briefings to the council. Yes, that's right. So Brittany asked or made the comment that the videos were for the public, not so much the decision makers. I mean, we showed it to the Tiwi Land Council as well, but it was not just made for them. It was for the general public, but also so both Tiwi people, but also non-Tiwi general public too, of course.
When you were out on community, in these remote communities where presumably English is a second or a third language and you could be working with many different age groups, do you have any tips or advice or lessons about how to best get your message across to the people?
So I guess in these two examples, the people we were working with spoke very good English. So you could see that. So that wasn't so much of an issue. You know, when English is not so well spoken, and something I mentioned before is that's when pictures and voice is so much more effective than detailed text and figures and data. So. You know, that's really all I could say in terms of that. When you're thinking of means to deliver information, delivering it by video, I think you'll find will be the most effective way of doing that in that situation. Yeah.
This is just a comment, really, that when we've done products like these, you know, we also employ cultural brokers, translators to, you know, as part of the project funds to help with dissemination of information in that way as well. just basically someone who, if you don't have connections in a community, you know, someone who represents that community that can help you talk to the right people, find the right people, you know, to help with your project, getting approvals and, you know, things like that. So you don't just kind of barge in and tell everyone what you're doing, but, you know, to do it in an appropriate way. Yeah.
Any more questions here or in the audience? I think there was an audio in the last video, or was both videos? Anybody in the, yeah. Okay, cool. So I think it was everything. Can we have just one question for anybody on Zoom? Has any questions? Final questions before we finish the session?
The answer to that question, was this the last video, is yes.
Yeah, okay. Cool. No, I think everything, I would check if for some reason people on Zoom could not hear any of the videos or don't see it. When I edit the video and I put it on our YouTube channel, I will plunk the videos in as they are. So then we make sure that it's actually has good quality. So there is a question from Aaron. Are there any other projects you are currently working on?
The short answer is yes. Got a wide range of them, so I'm not sure what I can say about that. But
yeah, can you just give us like one example, like one that you like to tell people about?
Well, I'm thinking in terms of particular relevance. Oh, I think of one recent one that Jane will know all about, and that's what we're involved in setting faunal standards for rehabilitation out at Ranger, Uranium Mine. That was a fair bit of science communication effort. Jane and Jane's put together a fabulous video on it all. Again, with the people directly affected saying how important it is. So, you know, a lot of the projects I'm working on are just not relevant for widespread public outreach, not because it's sensitive or confidential, it's just whatever. So, for example, over the next 6 months, I'll be conducting a survey of the Beetaloo Basin as part of fracking baseline studies. It's a bit of fun.
Science communication doesn't always just have to be to the public, which is, you know, why it's important to define your audience. Whereas obviously, you know, for yours it was the public, but you still need to communicate your Beetaloo Basin findings as well. It'll just be a different audience, so it'll be different techniques probably to use for that. Right. Yeah.
For those sort of straightforward technical projects, it's normally just a written report, so it's much simpler than, you know, so we're not going to be producing a video to give to the federal government our findings. It's just a report and they'll digest them.
It's kind of awkward. Is this working?
Just to follow up on that, though, I think it's an important point too that even when you are presenting to a scientific audience, it's incredibly important to step back and focus on the relevance, outcomes, and impact. And otherwise, your story will not have the impact in the scientific literature as well. And so, if you want to publish your research in a journal that has high impact, unless you pitch it in terms of something that's highly relevant and the outcomes of your work have been important to that field, you will not get it in a good journal. And so it's taking that strategic approach to communication your science is just as important in a specialist scientific arena as it is to the general public. Yeah, sorry, Brittany. What?
I was just wondering, with the videos, did you work with someone like Jane on that, or did you kind of develop the script and the main message of the video yourself?
Yeah, so this is before Jane. This is with Cyro before Jane's. It wasn't with Jane. So yeah, so they were heavily scripted, and so the Kakadu one, it was me asking questions so it was mostly Peter and then Sandra doing it, sort of these key questions that sort of hit the relevance and impact side of things, and them responding. And then the Tiwi one was very heavily scripted, where we worked with the Land Council and Willie just to get it all done. Yeah.
So behind the scenes, you have these key questions that you want answered in the video.
Yeah, it's being on message, and I'm sure Jane will tell you about this when she talks in a couple of weeks. You've got to be very clear. And the same with you writing a scientific paper. You've got to be able to be very clear what it is your message that you can say in just a few words, and not just have this incoherent rambling rant about vague stuff. And so, yeah, it really is important to be clear. I mean, that's why the politicians have always got their advisors to get them on message, even if it's not answering the question, because it is important, if you communicate, to make sure you're very clear what it is that you want to say, and say it in a clear way that hits its target.
I think it was very interesting that I also noticed that the message I think that you really want to take home, it was repeated a few times. It was like, oh, it's good because there were jobs for the next generations and things like that. I saw that happening a couple of times, people saying it, just to make sure that that message is taken. I thought that was very interesting in the video. And I think someone wants to do a phoning.
Gary, good luck to you. Good luck.
You need to know that people who are specialists in a particular animal don't necessarily good at keeping them. I don't know, I'm terrible with turtles. I had turtles when I was a child and they all died. I promised myself never to have one again.
I've never had an ant colony kept, so it's not.
Yeah, we are terrible with that.
I'm terrible or not at it.
No, I can tell you, I am terrible with turtles. I cannot have one. They all have. And ants are cool. They're one in Casuarina. Did you see them? Yeah, they're really cool. Okay, I think we have is a very Alan. Thank you very much for such an interesting talk. I think it was really good, to see the side of a scientist, because that's your job, is to be a scientist, to be doing research, but and the effort that you have put into science communication and science outreach, and it's and you can see the fruits of it over the years around it. So thank you very much.